Hello and welcome to this game review. So this was an interesting game, and from it you can learn quite a bit about attacks and some attacking principles. So it started as some Najdorf, both sides developed quite sensibly, bishop e3, queen d2, and castles queenside. Black plays b6, which is a very strange move. I assume this was maybe a mouse slip. b5 is the usual move in such positions. But okay, b6. And here white should be better because he's one tempo up compared to normal positions, as black will have to play b5, b4 at some point anyway. So bishop e2. And of course this is a natural move, but this doesn't really do much. White should just start his attack with g4. And this is not only an attack on the king, but also an attack on the square on d5, as white tries to push away this knight to get the square on d5. So the sooner you do this, the better. So bishop e2, knight b d7, and h4. But this was kind of a misunderstanding of the position, as again, white's idea is mainly g4, g5. Not specifically to attack the king, though of course it is part of the plan as well, but mainly to get the square on d5, as now if white puts a knight here, then he will have to recapture with the pawn, which is also possible, but it is not ideal. White wants to eliminate this knight, so g4 is the usual way to play. At some point we can also play king b1 to guard our own king, for example after b5, now g4, and again white is doing quite well. At h4, this doesn't really do much in itself, as h5, h6 is not really a very good idea, since if the position closes up, then we will not really have counterplay against this king. So either way, we will need the g-pawn, but the h-pawn will not necessarily be needed. So it is quite important with which pawn you start pushing. Not to mention g4, g5 actually creates a threat. So h4, queen b8, h5, but again, this is not really the correct way to play this, as after h5, h6, it will actually be quite hard to get g4, g5 in. As you saw, you had to sacrifice the exchange, which is not usually necessary for such positions. If we play the g4, let's say rook c8 or something, g5, knight h5, we can continue with f4, for example. The knight can go to d5, and the white should be crashing through eventually on the king side. But h5, h6, and now white's plan is getting a bit more complicated. After knight h7, black has good control over the square, and white insists on playing g5, but for this he will have to sacrifice an exchange, which is quite a big investment for an attack that is not necessarily going to work out very well. Instead, probably knight e5 was the right time to play this, because now the knight is not on f6, black has to take usually, and white has a choice in such positions, taking with the pawn to open up this bishop, or taking with the queen to keep the d-file open, and both sides give white maybe a small advantage. At some point king b1 should be played, and white is doing quite well. At some point f4 is the plan. But rook d2 g1 and g5, and this gives up an exchange, but now there aren't that many pieces on the board to attack with, so I wouldn't be too optimistic. f6, queen g2, knight f8, and black has their bases kind of covered if h6 and even g5 would be played. And now there are no pawn breaks for white, the rooks will help in the defense, and this pawn is only blocking white's rook. Rook g1, rook a7, and now white understood that he needs more pieces in the game, and the usual bad piece in these positions is the knight on b3. It is completely dominated, so at some point it must be improved. The usual route is through d2 to e4 after the pawn has come to d5. So bishop d3, queen c7, knight d5, and now the bishop has been opened, so now white has 3 attackers. But this will not really be enough. He needs to improve the knight as well. After queen f7, he goes f4 to defend this pawn. But at this point, material shouldn't really matter for white, as he is an exchange down anyway. But so here, knight e2 should be played to improve the last piece. And then the attack might come to something. For example, after this, bishop f5, the rook has to move, and knight e4. And now white actually has some kind of real threats, like knight f6 and h6 at some point as well, with the idea to sacrifice And at this point, white's attack is actually quite strong. Still, after something like king h8, king b1, the game goes on, white is down some material, but the rooks are not really playing, and white at some point can start playing h6. So for an attack to work, we need as many pieces in the game as possible, and here, as you can see, the bishop, rook, and queen are not enough. We needed the knight as well. And now everything collapses. Here, white can still play on with rook h1. Now that the h-pawn is gone, then we can use the h-file, queen h3, threatening this. Then after the king goes to f7, we can now start attacking g7 again, as the rook will be blocked. And white has quite good chances for an attack here. But instead, white completely goes off the rails and takes the pawn on a6. But this pawn doesn't matter at all, and again we have to understand that material doesn't matter for white, because in either case, if you take this pawn or if you don't take it, the endgame will be lost at any point anyway. So we shouldn't care about one meager pawn. We should try to get an attack against this king as soon as possible, because if we do not, then we will lose in either case. And here the bishop is simply out of play, it doesn't do much on a6, and it just opened up the opponent's rook. And now black gets some initiative, c3, rook a2, but now our pieces are not attacking anymore, and we got checkmated quite quickly. So quite an unfortunate ending. White was playing well for the initiative, but then somehow instead of improving the pieces with the knight going to e4, white decided to stray a bit to the queen side, which left white's attack hopeless, and black got a chance to counterattack. So quite an interesting game, and hopefully you found this analysis useful. Mainly it's about how to attack on the king side, and usually h4, h5 is not really much of an attack here, as black successfully blocked the g5 push, after which it was not that easy to attack for white. Though here, if g4, g5 is played, or for example h4, h5, and then g4, g5, to not allow knight h5, then the attack would have been quite a bit more effective.